In this video, we are going to cover the JMeter basic configuration elements. We will go over the HTTP request defaults, HTTP header manager, HTTP cache manager, HTTP cookie manager, and finally the DNS cache manager. We will start with an empty script and we'll be adding the different configuration elements to our test plan. So the first step will be to go into the test plan and add the configuration element HTTP request defaults. If we open the thread group of our script, we can see that we already have two HTTP requests. The requests are to our demo site, demoplace.com. So we have a first request to the homepage, which is with the path /, and then a second request to view one specific product with the path prod.html and using a specific parameter. So now what I would like to do is to set the values in the HTTP request default and modify the different requests of my thread group. So what is the goal of using the HTTP request default? The main aim is to avoid data duplication in tests and to make the test plans more easily maintainable. So what if instead of defining the server name in each of the requests, we define it in the HTTP request default? So we change the value of the server in the HTTP request default, and then we can delete the value from all the other requests. Let's save it, and let's add to our test plan a view results tree listener to analyze what happened when we run this test. So we will run this test, and we will see that the homepage request and the view product request, even though we are not specifying the server name, as we are specifying it on the HTTP request defaults, this request will be hitting demoplace.com. So if we go into the homepage request and into the tab request, we can see that we did a get request to demoplace.com, which is the homepage, and then the view product again is getting the server name from the request defaults. Now, the second configuration element that we will add is the HTTP header manager. So the header manager lets you add or override HTTP request header. It specifies a list of HTTP header that will be added to the HTTP samplers on the JMeter test plan. The header will be added to those samplers which are on the scope of the HTTP header manager. So let's add an entry to the HTTP header manager by clicking on the button Add Header. So our first header will be the header accept language, and the value will be English. This header will be added to all the HTTP samplers which are on the scope of this header manager. Let's run again this test and see what happened to the header of our request. So while this test is running, I want to show you the first time that we ran this test, what were the headers involved. So if we go into the request header, we only had 3 headers, which were the default headers of JMeter. Now, when we run it the second time, a new header was added to our HTTP request, which is the one that we defined in the header manager. Okay, let's add now our third element, which is the cache manager. The HTTP cache manager is used to add caching functionality. If you want a reduction of traffic over the internet, then one such item is the caching of resources downloaded from the network for use in the subsequent request without triggering the web server. The first time you test, when a certain URL is requested from the server, JMeter saves the results to RAM. Every resource file has the HTTP header with the name last modified, which indicates the date and the time at which the origin server believes the variant was last modified. Before executing the next sampler, the sampler checks to see if there is an entry in the cache, and if so, the if last modified and if none match conditional headers are set for the request. Okay, let's check now on the configuration of the HTTP cache manager. By default, the cache manager will store up to 5,000 items in the cache for each virtual user thread. For clear cache each iteration, if it is checked, then the cache is cleared at the start of the thread. If the second option is selected, then the cache control expires value is checked against the current time. If the request is a GET request and the timestamp is in the future, then the sampler returns immediately without requesting the URL, and as a result, the response is returned from the cache with a much shorter response time. The next configuration element that we will add is the cookie manager, and the cookie manager will store and send cookies as a web browser. If you have an HTTP request and its response contains a cookie, then the cookie manager automatically stores that cookie and it will use it for all future requests. Each JMeter thread has its own cookie storage area. So if you are testing a website that uses a cookie for the session information, each JMeter thread will have its own session. In the configuration of the cookie manager, we can select either to clear or not the cookies after each iteration and select which cookie policy we will use to manage the cookie. Also, we can manually add a cookie to the cookie manager by clicking on this button, but consider that by adding a cookie manually, this cookie will be shared by all JMeter threads. Now, let's see an example of how a cookie is stored from an HTTP sampler and used for a future request without creating it manually on the cookie manager. For this demo, I added to my thread group a third request, which is the login request. If the login is successful, I will obtain on the response a cookie with the token, and then I would like to use that cookie for the feature request homepage. So let's run once this test to analyze what happened. We have the login request, and if we go into the response data, response headers, we can see that two cookies were created from the login request, the token and the session. Now, if we go into the homepage request and let's see the request, you can see that the cookie data was added to the homepage request with the token and the session. Okay, let's continue now with the DNS cache manager. So let's add it to our test plan. So DNS is also known as the domain name server, and it's a naming system for computers which converts human readable names like, for example, demobilize.com to an IP address like 93.18, etc. For example, if you open demobilize.com in your browser, it does a DNS lookup of the associated IP address. As such, the actual request is made from your computer's IP address to the Blaze demo server IP address. We have different configurations for the DNS cache manager. We can clear cache in each iteration, and this means that the DNS cache manager caches the IP address. The DNS hostname pairs and returns the cached value if the DNS hostname has a match in its internal cache. If this checkbox is enabled, then the cache will be cleared at the start of the thread. Then we can select either to use the system DNS resolver or a custom DNS resolver. If we use the system DNS resolver, then the DNS cache manager will query DNS servers defined in your OS network configuration in order to determine the hostname for each thread representing virtual users. If you use the custom DNS resolver, you can specify one or more DNS servers in this list by clicking on Add. And if more than one server is provided, then the DNS cache manager will choose a random one for each call, and it will run as a round-robin mechanism. If nothing is provided, then the system DNS resolver will be used. When you add the DNS server, you can also create a static host table where you can add the host and the corresponding hostname or IP address.